Now, one of the biggest complaints made against the Star Wars sequel trilogy is that there was no overall game plan going into it, that each writer and director that came in to do an individual episode or movie was allowed to take the story in whatever direction they wanted, instead of following some sort of overall outline that was initially put in place by someone who was overseeing or dictating the direction and or story of the whole trilogy. And of all the debates I've had with people in the wake of Episode 8, easily one of the most popular and heated topics has been whether or not what Rian Johnson did with The Last Jedi followed some sort of plan, or at the very least carried on the general idea that J.J. Abrams laid out in Episode 7. Or, in other words, did The Last Jedi end up being more or less what J.J. Abrams had in mind for Episode 8, or did Rian Johnson essentially do whatever he damn well pleased with The Last Jedi, and ignored anything and everything JJ may have originally had in mind? This then has a tendency to lead into the debate of who quote-unquote destroyed Star Wars, or at least who destroyed the sequel trilogy. Was it J.J. Abrams who did it by starting us out with a rehash of the original trilogy, one that left us with a giant mystery box full of questions for the next movie to answer? Or was it Rian Johnson who destroyed it by all but ignoring that mystery box, or by giving us answers that, to use that word I know some of you are sick of by now, subverted our expectations? Or are all the people who don't like the sequel trilogy crazy, and these are both great movies telling us one perfectly crafted and cohesive story? Well, let me first address that last part there, because even if you love everything about the sequel trilogy thus far, which is fine if you do, it's hard to deny that J.J. Abrams and Rian Johnson weren't exactly on the same page with the direction of the story. After all, Daisy Ridley, the actress who plays Rey, said a while back now that J.J. Abrams had written perhaps drafts or at least story treatments for the next two episodes, but that Rian Johnson not only didn't use them for Episode 8, but that he didn't keep anything from them. We also have what Mark Hamill told us, that originally Episode 7 was going to end with Rey finding Luke with rocks floating around him, but that Rian Johnson asked for that ending to be changed, likely because these two had very different visions or ideas for the way Luke would be when we ultimately found him in the story, with J.J. Abrams keeping him as a Jedi who, perhaps, had gone to the first Jedi Temple of all places, and left a map behind, mind you, to find answers about Snoke and so that others could find him if need be. While, on the other hand, Rian Johnson thought Luke went to the most unfindable place in the galaxy just to die, and that we should just forget the fact that a map of him existed, which was the MacGuffin of the first movie, or the thing everyone was looking for. So, at a very fundamental level here, these guys were not on the same page about what to do with arguably the most important character in the trilogy, or the one who would have the greatest impact on our new main protagonist, Rey. Sure, these two guys no doubt sat down and talked and discussed the story. There may have even been some level of agreement on certain things. But at the end of the day, or so we were told, Rian Johnson had full creative freedom with Episode 8. And again, going back to what Daisy Ridley said, he didn't use any of J.J. Abrams' original ideas for the story. But not only that, but some of the more interesting characters from Episode 7 also got all but ignored by Rian Johnson, like the Knights of Ren, for example, which he said he couldn't find a place for in his story. He also barely used Maz Kanata, and the way he did use her was odd. Like he was told by the powers that be that he had to throw her in there somewhere, and so he did. And then there's Snoke, of course, a character most of us wanted to know more about, got used as a mere plot device to push Kylo Ren forward, which left this whole trilogy without a truly credible villain, hence Palpatine is now coming back in Episode 9. And this all then leads some to wonder if J.J. Abrams might be a bit bitter about the direction The Last Jedi took the story in, the story that he started, despite him publicly voicing his approval and appreciation for Episode 8 and the work of Rian Johnson. Because, as I like to point out to people who cite this as absolute proof that they were on the same page the whole time, what do you really expect J.J. Abrams to say when asked about Episode 8, even if he absolutely hates it? I mean, do you honestly expect him to say as much, to openly criticize Rian Johnson and the film he made, and to say how the movie was nothing like he wanted it to be, that all his setup got ignored? Do you think he'd risk angering Disney by doing that, risk angering the largest name in the entertainment industry today? Or would you maybe expect him to say what they, meaning Disney and Lucasfilm, wanted him to say? And by the fact that he's now directing Episode 9, I'd say there's a very good chance Disney and Lucasfilm were happy with the way he'd handled things. And to be clear before going on here, sure, there is every chance J.J. Abrams enjoyed and was happy with The Last Jedi, despite it clearly going in a different direction than what he'd probably originally intended. Just like there's every chance he absolutely hated everything about it, and only said what he wanted to say, and is now directing episode 9 because he played ball and did what he was supposed to do according to Lucasfilm and Disney. However, even if JJ did love The Last Jedi, there's still nothing to say he doesn't want to more or less finish the original story he began with in episode 7, which has led some to believe he may retcon or change the perception of things that happened in The Last Jedi, with one possible example being that, sure, Rey's parents were nobody, but surprise, her grandfather was Palpatine. Anyway, recently J.J. Abrams addressed this possibility, and this idea that episode 8 ruined the story he was telling in an interview, and said this: "The story that we're telling, the story that we started to conceive when we did The Force Awakens, was allowed to continue. Episode 8 didn't really derail anything that we were thinking about. But I will say that the fun of this movie is that these characters are all together on this adventure as a group. That's the thing that I was most excited about, to see the dynamic between these characters that these amazing actors play on this desperate, seat-of-your-pants adventure." Okay, now what I actually found to be the most interesting thing he said here is that the story we started to conceive in The Force Awakens was allowed to continue. To me, JJ's basically all but confirming here that no, The Last Jedi truly didn't continue the story he started in a way he would have liked, but that it also didn't derail things in a way that he couldn't bring it back to where he wanted. I mean, saying that it was allowed to continue is such an odd way of phrasing it if episode 8 had just been part of the plan, if it had just continued the story they'd all agreed upon. Because if this was one big cohesive thing, with everyone on the same page, wouldn't he have just simply said, "We're continuing the story that's been in place all along, not that it's being allowed to continue"? Anyway, J.J. Abrams then goes on to say that the fun part of this new movie is that all these new characters will be together for one singular adventure, when maybe one of the worst parts of The Last Jedi, one of its biggest flaws or mistakes, is that all the main characters were split up. Now sure, Rey going off to train with Luke was one thing, but splitting up Poe and Finn, seemingly for the sake of introducing two new characters, Rose and Holdo, was another thing entirely. And doing it, splitting up Poe and Finn, worked about as well, I'd say, as splitting up Han and Leia would have worked in The Empire Strikes Back. Because one of the best parts about The Force Awakens, in my opinion at least, was the fast friendship formed between Poe and Finn, and it should have been those two, and maybe some other random troopers who went on the side quest in this movie to get the fuel for the fleet, and they could have been pursued by the Knights of Ren, which they were ill-equipped to deal with, and so, as troopers are killed off, Poe would have had to make the hard choice to abandon his mission and concede to himself failure. That is, if you still wanted to go with that theme or that lesson or arc with this character, that failure is the greatest teacher. This then means the whole Holdo subplot could have been dropped entirely in favor of just having Admiral Akbar take command of the fleet, and he even tells Poe and Finn after authorizing their mission that he's taking the fleet to Crate as a last-ditch resort should they fail. Anyway, though maybe this comment from J.J. Abrams about bringing these characters together being the best part of the story essentially wasn't exactly intended as a knock against Rian Johnson and The Last Jedi, there's still no denying that splitting up all these new characters in the middle act of the story, when their friendships should have been solidified, was a really odd choice to make. And by the fact that we've yet to see much out of Rose, outside of the actress who plays her, that being Kelly Marie Tran, showing up at Star Wars Celebration in April, I almost wonder if J.J. Abrams is now going to all but ignore a character Rian Johnson introduced, or use her only as much as he has to. So, love or hate the Star Wars sequel trilogy, it seems pretty clear that there was no sort of great grand plan that both J.J. Abrams and Rian Johnson were fully on board with, that no one at the very top came up with a story, or had someone come up with a story, that was going to be the very foundation of the whole sequel trilogy that all the writers and directors who came on board had to strictly adhere to. Sure, it seems like J.J. Abrams had come up with a general outline, but it also seems pretty clear that Rian Johnson didn't give a damn about that outline and made the movie he wanted to make. But that apparently J.J. Abrams will still be allowed to continue his story despite what happened in the previous movie. Which is somehow a combination of hilarious, ridiculous, and sad all at the same time when you really think about it. Because it goes to show there is no leadership, that no one at the top had any sort of plan for the trilogy and was just winging it as they went. Because by J.J. Abrams all but saying that he can work around what the last part of the story did by not mentioning that they're going to build on what the last story did and carry it forward, it makes the middle part of the story sound more like an obstacle to be dealt with than anything else. Which is where the truly sad part comes in. It's sad that even if Episode 9 turns out to be a great movie, which, yes, there is a chance that could happen still, It'll apparently become that in spite of what the previous movie did, not in large part because of it, which is the way it should be. Hell, J.J. Abrams even says right here in his comment that it didn't really derail anything. He doesn't, however, say it didn't derail anything at all, which I think clearly means there were things Rian Johnson did with The Last Jedi that, yeah, derailed some ideas J.J. Abrams originally had. And maybe the real question here should be, why was Rian Johnson allowed to do whatever the hell he wanted with The Last Jedi? Why was he allowed to ignore ideas J.J. Abrams had set up? Because if those initial ideas from J.J. weren't great to begin with, if that's not the direction the story should have gone in, why was he allowed to start off with them? Why begin a story one way, only to turn it on its head at the midway point, only to then let the guy who started it all come back to finish what he originally had planned? And that then brings us back to the original question. Who's to blame for all this? Do we blame J.J. Abrams on The Force Awakens? Do we blame his movie that was a rehash of the original trilogy, more or less? Do we blame him for a movie that just brought up so many questions that it set Rian Johnson up for failure if he tried to answer them all? Or do we blame Rian Johnson, who just ignored pretty much all those questions, or as many as he could, it seemed, in favor of telling what very much feels like his own story, one devoid of any care of what the fans may have wanted, or what J.J. Abrams may have tried to set up? But then again, both of these guys could only do with Star Wars what they were allowed to do. And well, since Kathleen Kennedy is the president of Lucasfilm, since she's the one who can veto anything and everything, assuming her mouse overlords don't interfere, I think the blame has to fall squarely on her shoulders. I go back to her quote from a few years ago now about how they approached Episode 7 the same way they would any other big tentpole movie, and it all becomes clear. The mindset to do something truly special or epic with this trilogy wasn't there, at least not with the person at the top. I mean, in another interview, she was asked if she'd always loved Star Wars, and instead of just giving an emphatic yes and gushing about it for a little bit, she said she loved it insofar as what it meant to the film industry at the time. And though I give her credit for being honest, that's a really odd answer for the president of Lucasfilm to give. And though I think that, in theory, sure, she could do a great job running things even if she's not a superfan. She does have an impressive resume in Hollywood, after all. It seems clear, though, that she's not surrounding herself or deferring to the right people who know what's best for the franchise, or at least what the fans on the whole want to see, and not having a clear, grand vision for the whole sequel trilogy set in place beforehand, before work on it actually began, one that everyone who wanted to be a part of this thing had to follow along with, may forever go down as the biggest mistake in the history of Star Wars, unless somehow J.J. Abrams pulls off an amazing miracle with Episode 9. Well, that's all I've got for you this time. Now it's your turn to tell me what you think about what J.J. Abrams had to say. Does this sound like a roundabout way of saying that, despite what Episode 8 did, I can finish my story, or do you interpret it another way? Whatever the case may be, let me know in the comments below, and let's talk some Star Wars. And until next time, thanks for watching.